Hey, welcome everyone. It's a really busy time of year, so I'm grateful to all of you for joining us today. I'm Carrie Tirado-Brayman, Director of the UB Gender Institute and Professor in the English Department here at UB. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the land upon which the University of Buffalo operates, which is the territory of the Seneca Nation, a member of the Haudenosaunee Six Nations Confederacy. Today, this region is still home to the Haudenosaunee people, and we're grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and share ideas in this territory. Today's talk is part of our Feminist Research Alliance, or what we call FRA series, which is now in its 11th year, and it features members of the UB community who share their work with us for this hour-long lunchtime event. So before I introduce today's speaker, I first want to make a few brief announcements. Our final FRA will be next Friday, May 5th at noon on Zoom with Celine Reynolds, who is a Baldy Center postdoc fellow and soon to be assistant professor in sociology at Indiana University. And she will be speaking on Title IX, How Sexual Harassment Became Sex Discrimination in American Higher Education. And we're putting the link to register for that Zoom talk in the chat box. Also next week is our final book launch for this academic year. It's on Wednesday, May 3rd from 3:30 to 5 at our favorite location, 509 O'Brien Hall. It will also be available via Zoom, so you can register for that event, and we'll put that link in the box. And it features Iris Braverman in the law school and her new book, Settling Nature, The Conservation Regime in Palestine, Israel, that just came out with Minnesota University Press. The respondent will be Layla Harris, professor in the Institute of Resources, Environment, and Sustainability, and their Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice at the University of British Columbia. So please join us for that event next Wednesday at 3:30, hybrid, in person, and virtual. And finally, our colleague Ronaldo Walcott in Africana and American Studies just wrote and said that Christina Sharp will be at UB on Tuesday evening, May 23rd. There's no other details. We don't know the time, but save the date. Christina Sharp's new book, Ordinary Notes, was just published, and there is a feature about her in today's New York Times, and we're going to put that link in the chat box for you to check out. There's also a New York Times review of her book that came out a few days ago. So now let's turn to today's event. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Loren Pilcher, Assistant Professor in the Department of Global Gender and Sexuality Studies at UB. Their research focuses on documentary and non-theatrical film and media with an emphasis on images of gender and race in the US and American South. They are currently working on a book project about government films produced in Jim Crow era Georgia and their reverberations in contemporary media. And the title of today's talk is Small Gauge State, Gender, Jim Crow, and Government Films. Looking forward to Loren, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Carrie. I really appreciate it. Thank you to Gender Institute for inviting me today and for organizing. Thanks, Carrie, for organizing everything. Thank you all for attending during your lunchtime. I really appreciate it. I'm going to share a bit with y'all today from, as Carrie said, from my ongoing book project, Small Gauge State, Gender, Jim Crow, and Government Film. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Right. All right, I want to start or introduce my project with an example, not so much an example, really an aha moment that I had last semester with teaching. I was teaching a What is Feminism course, and I structured it around watching contemporary documentaries every week as a way for students to think through what feminism means and how we understand it and communicate about it using nonfiction media. So we watched these two documentaries, Aftershock, which is a documentary that examines the Black maternal mortality rate in the United States, impacts of medical racism, as well as The Queen of Basketball. It's a short documentary about the groundbreaking but under-acknowledged career of women's basketball player Lucia Harris. So in watching both of these documentaries, I noticed that they borrow and they integrate brief scenes from two government films made in mid-20th century Georgia. These two films are part of my project. I know these two films well. And so seeing them referenced in both of these documentaries really stood out to me. Something was definitely sort of going on. And the two films that are referenced are All My Babies, A Midwife's Own Story from 1950 and Palmer Street, from 1952 and Palmer Street from 1950. And both of these films were made as educational tools for the Georgia Department of Public Health. The original films employ a documentary mode to depict Black women and families in Georgia from the perspective of a segregated institution, one that was aimed at promoting improved health in Black communities via midwife training and mental health education. So the fact that these contemporary documentaries engage with their depictions of Black women and families in the Jim Crow South confirmed for me that something about these images is relevant and present in current discussions of institutional racism and sexism. Their contexts seem to be taking on new meaning as they speak to issues that have evolved and the ways that they've been represented. Okay, so to zoom out for just a second, how did I get here to government film in mid-century Georgia? So I'll start by giving like the two big pieces of this project and then the sort of backstory of how I sort of got here. So on one hand, my project is trying to account historically for government film production in the US South in these 2 decades after World War II. Particularly in Georgia. So I'll show you these are some stills from different films that I'm using in my project. So what I discovered in research was that Georgia was a sort of hub for federal and state agencies in the South that were making these non-theatrical films for informational and practical functions. So agricultural education, promoting public health, offering social and family guidance, furthering American democracy, and the filmmaking followed this sort of collaborative model that aimed to visualize real people and communities in the South, but also like to modernize these Southern institutions and their logics and values. And these were complementary and also conflicting aims at times. And given the infrastructure of government agencies in Georgia and the South, they were divided along racial and gender lines. And I think you can see that sort of already at play in just these stills that I've pulled in terms of where they're very much organized along those lines. Yeah, a big part of that is thinking about how all of that crystallizes in these images of gender and race in these films. The second piece of the project considers how these government productions, their visions of race and gender reverberate today in a range of nonfiction media, but also the social issues and debates that they address. Some of these films have found renewed circulation online, and All My Babies and Palmer Street are a good example of that. They've been online for a while, and they're freely available. They circulate a good bit in comparison to some of the other films that are less, they're online, but they're less known. But even so, the films that are less known, they get at settings and topics that are still pertinent to discussions of institutional sexism and racism. Agriculture and land ownership, domestic labor, public health, community development, civic education. And there are even some resonances of these non-theatrical films in media today that are played on sort of sensationally and engaged in sort of a local and regional sort of flavor, from campaign ads, political campaign ads to podcasts. So my project gets into some of that as well. So how did I get here to these two big pieces, to this particular focus? I have a background in film and media studies, and in getting that background, I had this interest in images of gender and sexuality, and it developed sort of in parallel toward this gravitation toward this unruly body of films that were made outside of the entertainment industry and culture in the US. I took a class early in graduate school on educational cinema. That led to an internship with a local film archivist in North Carolina, where I spent hours digitizing a whole range of films that were made for classrooms, for civic events, for job training, for promotion, for propaganda, for home use, private and amateur films. And in getting that experience, I realized that film production since the early 20th century was much more embedded in our social everyday world than the art films and the popular movies that are pretty common in film curriculums. So the medium of film, especially after the introduction of 16mm format and the development of portable cameras and projection equipment, was widespread in institutional and private settings. And I was drawn to these films because they felt somehow closer to the messiness of reality, of just honestly just felt like more accessible in ways that they just spoke to, and they're also just sort of devalued in like film culture, and seen as sort of disposable, as temporal in use and value, hybrid in their forms. So that also spoke to another interest that was developing in queer theory and a growing interest in archives. So that, in tandem with just being frustrated with sort of urban bias, privileging of middle and upper class whiteness, simplistic narratives of region in American gender and sexuality studies, that all sort of came together for me. So that pushed me toward the non-theatrical films and toward the South as well. I was interested and have been interested in ideas and images of gender and sexuality in the South because they are inseparable from thinking about the South's history, from its economic, institutional, and social system of racial exploitation and violence. So I really wanted to understand what films are being made in the South, what kind of non-theatrical films, how do they portray gender, sexuality, race, why, and to what end. So that's sort of where this overall interest came from. So once I started digging into looking into non-theatrical films made in the South, and just in general, once you start to look into theatrical films, you realize that the mid-20th century was a heyday of state film production in the US and in Europe. This has a lot to do with World War II. The integration of non-theatrical filmmaking into military and civilian operations during the war established this model and infrastructure that continued after the war. So as scholars like Dan Strebel and Hadi Hassan have shown, the resources that were poured into film instruction and training and propaganda during the war carried over and were built upon afterwards. So people in the military during the war learned filmmaking and projection skills. There was a ton of just equipment made, portable equipment for projection and production. And what this did, those resources spread, and this led to this boom in non-theatrical filmmaking by state entities and industrial entities as well in the US. And film was seen as this educational, cutting-edge educational and ideological tool. So that was sort of guiding it as well. And what this does is it really impacts documentary filmmaking. The history of documentary in the US is already grounded prior to this period in government photography and government film production. But it is amplified, expanded here. And you have these filmmakers pursuing opportunities to depict real people and places via nonfiction forms. They're often doing so with institutional sponsors and in these institutional settings, and blending like institutional and instructional frameworks with what we think of as conventional, I guess, like nonfiction imagery. So to give you an idea of just looking, you can see this sort of mid-century expansion of film production in some of the archives I've been using for my project. So here you'll see, these are documents from the US Information Service that became the US Information Agency. This organization within the federal government under the Department of State was initially the Office of War Information during World War II, and then it becomes the sort of PR wing and propaganda arm into the Cold War. So both of these documents are taken from initiatives of the International Motion Picture Service within the USIA. So you can see in both, they're thinking in very much a propaganda context about using motion pictures globally in sort of spreading American democracy. There's an emphasis on films and visuals spread information and communicate in a much more effective way. There's also, if you see on the right there, this is a report on a specific program called the Common Denominator Program, which actually includes a film made in Georgia that called Men of the Forest that I include in one of my chapters. You'll see the emphasis on like human, as I say, human relations is the common denominator, representing people or life in the US as it actually is, as this way of realistically representing the United States and democracy in the United States in this Cold War context. Another archive I've been working with is the Georgia Cooperative Agricultural Extension Service. And they published a sort of annual guide report every year. And in those mid-century years, that visual aids section expands significantly, as does their library of films as well. So these are just some examples of what's included in those, an emphasis on motion pictures and visual aids and how they're useful for education, for agricultural extension, how learning through visual aids is more effective. They also, I will add, and thinking about they made their own films. They started their own visual production unit. They brought in a filmmaker who made 1 to 2 feature-length films a year, in addition to TV spots and everything else. So they were producing, collecting films in addition to that. And the last example here from the archives I'm working with, the filmmaker behind the films I mentioned in my opening, All My Babies and Palmer Street, George Stoney, been working with his records, which I'll get into in a little bit, but George Stoney is sort of an example of really what happens in mid-century with non-theatrical films. He serves in the military as a photo interpreter for the Air Force. He returns, works for the Farm Security Administration, and soon gets a job for the Southern Educational Film Production Service in Georgia, and stays there for a bit, and eventually founds his own company. And he works with government and institutional sponsors, and a variety of them, a significant number of them, throughout his career. And he eventually moves on from that, but he does that for a while, and he's a pretty important figure for doing that. So just as you see here, some of his titles and sponsors, you'll see reflected there. He also worked to distribute his films outside of the South as well. As you'll see, the Center for Mass Communication of Columbia University Press, he worked with often to distribute and promote his films as sort of documentaries. All right. As you can see from these archives that I've been working with, federal and state government agencies engaged in film production in the South during mid-century. As I've been researching these films, Georgia has emerged as this site where films were being made regularly by state organizations like Georgia Agricultural Extension, the Georgia Department of Public Health. At times, they included business and civic sponsorship in addition to that, as you'll see with the Riches sponsoring one of the films here in the credits there. You also had federal productions happening in the state as well. So the U.S. Information Service and the Communicable Disease Center, which became the CDC, had productions in the state as well. So in getting a sense of these films and their sponsorships, and they're made for in a variety of instructional and promotional aims, it became clear to me, and has become clear to me, that Georgia and the South were being represented pretty distinctly in a distinctly different way than sort of what's going on in Hollywood and what has been sort of popularized. It's pretty far from that nostalgic antebellum Civil War South imagery in popular culture in Hollywood. There is an emphasis on nonfiction documentary images of actual people and places in the present, in the state, in Georgia. But this always comes hand in hand with this instructional narrative that emphasizes a state and a region that is in the midst of economic and institutional modernization. And often that comes together in, or is projected onto and scripted into these gender roles and behaviors. Modernization is happening by people sort of fulfilling these gendered roles and behaviors. And the other piece of it is that that racial division is there as well. Like, racial segregation is shaping the logic of these films and these gendered roles and behaviors, but there is like no direct engagement or addressing of Jim Crow laws or any dealing with that on screen or directly. It is almost entirely avoided. All right, that's sort of the background, the larger sort of frame, thinking about these mid-century Georgia films, how I kind of got here, what they're like. I want to like zoom in a little bit here and take you kind of back to All My Babies in Palmer Street, the films that I mentioned in my opening, and sort of give you an idea of like how one of my chapters is sort of developing, some new research I've done. So kind of like where I started with these films and some stuff that I found and that is making me think about them, or deepening my sort of understanding of them. So All My Babies, A Midwife's Own Story, Palmer Street, both of these films are probably, of the films made in mid-century Georgia, perhaps the best known. And the most sort of, they have circulated perhaps the widest. They've been, as I said earlier, publicly accessible online for a while. Palmer Street was added to Internet Archive in 2002. And I suspect a similar time frame for All My Babies, but it got an official sponsored digitization that was put up on Internet Archive in 2013. And both of them are like in multiple places online. They stand out in that circulation, that more recent circulation, for their in-depth documentary depiction of Black midwives and women, families, communities in rural Georgia in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And they continue to circulate as artifacts from the past in that way. For example, I just recently saw All My Babies featured in an exhibit on African-American midwifery at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And the film sort of referenced and a video element to the exhibit as well. So when I first started researching, looking into these films years ago, and what eventually led to an article publication, what struck me as sort of key was this tension in these films between this intimate documentary engagement with real people, with the like Black midwives in rural segregated Georgia. So that documentary engagement gets really oriented around George Stoney, the filmmaker. And so there's that element of it. And then there is this institutional perspective, this set of objectives that the Georgia Department of Public Health had for the film, and how those shaped the frame, how these women were depicted, and with the ultimate aim that the Georgia Department of Public Health wanted an educational tool to improve health in Black communities. And that was their sort of frame. So that the tension between those two things is what sort of stood out to me in my initial sort of reading of them. So on the one hand, you have, and these are stills from production of both the films. On the one hand, you have these projects that were part of George Stoney's personal and idealistic investment in documentary filmmaking. So In Making Palmer Street, for example, he was the lead writer and a director for the Southern Educational Film Production Service. He spent months with the Merritt family that's featured in the film. And he did the same a few years later. He made All My Babies without the service. He wasn't no longer working there, but he pursued the topic out of his own interest. He pursued funding that was allocated from the Georgia Department of Public Health for mental health. He supplemented that funding by getting sponsorship from the Association of American Medical Colleges and putting in some of his own money. He again spent months with the midwife, Mary Coley, who's at the center of the film, and formed a friendship with her that's reflected in his letter correspondence and his papers. This is reflected in the film itself by the positions of the cameras inside the private homes of Coley, the Merritt family, where Stoney spent significant time. It's reflected in maps that he had of the rooms of their houses and in his records. It's reflected in the live birth that he shot and was there for filming for hours of one of Mary Coley's mothers who delivered during the production process. The other piece of Stoney and his documentary interest is that he secured distribution of these films nationally and internationally, and they were seen in intellectual and documentary circles as well as educational and public health settings. So he, much more so than the Georgia Department of Public Health, had pursued that and made that happen. The trajectory of his career also played a role in their circulation. He moved on, he stayed in the South and made films in this institutional model for a while, but he moved on in the late 1960s to serve as the director of a social documentary initiative or project within the National Film Board of Canada. And then he finished out his career as a professor at NYU. So that's what you have on one hand with these films. And then on the other hand, you have that institutional instructional perspective in both All My Babies and Palmer Street. And it's in keeping with the Georgia Department of Public Health's aims. For example, in stating the purpose during planning, as Stoney was writing and planning the film, he makes clear, and this comes through in the film as well, that this film focuses on midwives, but only because they're necessary in these rural areas right now. But the real focus is regulation by the health department. They need to have improved skills. We're relying on them, but they really need to be regulated. And the regulation from the health department is the big sort of emphasis. So as he says here in his sort of planning document, today, the records of vital statistics, when read uncritically, appear to indicate that mothers and babies are as safe when under the care of this unprofessional group as they are when assisted by physicians. Looking a bit closer, however, one discovers that much of this gain in safety for mothers and infants has been brought about by regulations that more and more limit the midwife's practice to women who have been checked and approved for midwife delivery at health department clinics. That sort of justification for the film and focus on regulation comes through in the opening text that introduces the film as well. It's sort of yes, we're focusing, it's sort of saying, yes, we're focusing, the film is focusing on midwives, but it's to improve their skills because good healthcare, quote, good medical care has not arrived yet in these rural areas. So the other ways in which this institutional perspective come into play in All My Babies is this instructional narrative that is developed. So the film focuses on two mothers, and it really sets up this prepared mother and not prepared mother scenario. And the whole structure is sort of fictional. The ideal mother was an actual mother that Mary Coley was caring for, but the unprepared mother was entirely fictionalization. And someone was more or less the woman who played her was acting. And the narrative falls kind of right in line with that idea of regulation, that the regulation by the health department is what is ultimately the organizing thing here. So you'll see in the character studies here that Stoney wrote, he talks about a prenatal clinic visit of Maribel, mother framed as unprepared, and talks about how there's indications that she needs special watching, that the midwife here is just going to be co-worker with the doctor. She has less responsibility here. In this case, the doctor is really the one that needs to be taking charge and this sort of treatment of Mirabelle. So these are all sort of like fictional elements that are added that are there alongside those documentary images as well. And the last one, I just came across this one recently in reading through Stoney's case studies. There's also just fictionalization at play in the portrayal of Mary Coley, the midwife at the center of the film. And so here in this paragraph, Stoney talks about that how they changed the portrayal of her family situation, her house. As it says there, the exterior of her ranch type home, for example, is perhaps a bit too expensive looking to be accepted by most of our audience. Few midwives are fortunate enough to have an automobile, so we won't see her using it. They also leave out her family, that she has children and her family life altogether. So there were, all of this is sort of justified in thinking about this is an educational tool for midwives. And so we have to, like Stoney's crafting this portrayal, these portrayals that are, framed as nonfiction in these ways to sort of suit how he and the Georgia Department of Public Health understand that. This also happened in Palmer Street as well. In Palmer Street, it has this structure of a like parent, like child. This film is very much about like this message of educating Black parents on how they influence their children, and framed as that sort of, that's what they mean by mental health. And so the film has these scenarios that it ponders, like that might potentially, they're framed as like, these might potentially harm children in their healthy development. So as you'll see in this preliminary treatment of the film, Stoney justifies the film by identifying this sort of, quote, heavy responsibility and, quote, need for careful preparation on the part of parents if the children are going to, quote, develop normally. In the film, that looks like these stage scenes and characterizations that are framed as teaching moments for parents to consider. So you have these fictional scenes that reinforce racial and class stereotypes of Black families, parents getting angry with their children, mom, dad are fighting one another at dinner. Children have to be left, they stay with relatives or they're alone because both parents have to work. All these are posed as problems that are primarily left to Mrs. Merritt, like they're sort of her responsibility. And the film, it ends with that on this sort of ambiguous note, where Mr. Merritt is sort of injured seriously at work. But this huge responsibility is sort of left in the question of what to do and what will happen to the children is still at play. So in thinking about these two, the documentary angle with Stoney and this institutional, like instructional crafting, and this narrative and perspective, when I initially was thinking through this tension and my initial article on these films, I landed on like this need to like confront and reckon with this institutional perspective in the films of the government sponsor and the Jim Crow South, and like how much of a role that plays in these documentary images. At the same time, also acknowledging that real people were documented on screen, and that they were living and working beyond this framework that's applied, living beyond any resistance to it. So that's, yeah, where I sort of landed in my initial work on these films. So as I've, in more recent research, my approach to these films has sort of deepened, and I'll try to explain some of the stuff I'm finding, and I'm still, I will say, working through it, some of the stuff. But I've spent some more time with the films, their records, the production records for these films are in Stoney's records that are housed at UNC. And what stands out to me is that it's less Stoney's persona as a filmmaker in this way. I think it comes from like film study and culture in general, this kind of like worship of the director, of this central figure, central white man figure that the film gets sort of associated with. But what is that sort of, in looking at things, is not how it really holds up. This government film culture in Georgia and in the South that's behind the production of these films is emerging more and more as I'm looking through stuff. And it's a bit harder to trace in the archives. But what I'm realizing is that it sheds more light on the representations of gender and race in Palmer Street and All My Babies and in other films from this period as well. So to explain what I mean, I've found more info on the Southern Educational Film Production Service. So Stoney was hired by and worked as one of the main members of this service in 1946. He made Palmer Street with this service. I have seen, and the name of the service floats around and stuff that's written on Stoney, but I've never, until recently, had not sort of really got a sense of what it was, if that makes sense. So in tracking down more info, I've figured out that it actually was this unusual regional film production unit that was operated in Athens, Georgia, at the University of Georgia, as housed at the university. And it was this collaborative service for film production, so collaboration with tax-supported public agencies. How does it develop? Basically, it's chartered in 1946, but it comes about from conversations. Basically, the Georgia Agricultural Extension Service goes to the Tennessee Valley Authority and is like, we need to establish a regional film production organization. And it's at first just an organization sort of that's going to be focused on agricultural extension education in the Valley states that TVA serves. But that leads, from what it seems, to a broader goal that there just need to be films, as you'll see here from this Film News article on it, films that Southern audiences needed films to show the land they know, the problems they're facing, to make suggestions for practical solutions to these problems. So that it was broadened to more public agencies than just agricultural extension sort of stuff. Basically, the organization is established as a nonprofit that works with all public agencies in the 7 Tennessee Valley states, and they add sort of South Carolina and Florida. They work on a freelance basis with these agencies. They get things started by a $40,000 grant from the Rockefeller General Education Board, and they set up a board of directors with a representative from each of those southern states. So, in that sort of long explanation of this organization, which is a very this sort of regional model is absolutely unique. 2 things stand out to me about it, and they're reflected in this news piece that I have here on the screen. One, the service's film work is described as this important project for socially modernizing the South in tandem with its economic modernization. So you'll see here on the snippet on the left side there that credit for this creation of this service embraces all those Southern leaders in education, industry, science, agriculture, with an awareness of the necessity for developing the human resources of their communities in parallel with the expansion of their material resources. So something's going on. These films are a part of this sort of modernization. Like, the people also need to be sort of modernized. The second thing that stands out to me is that the services films are getting picked up and like seen as valuable outside the South. You'll see in that same snippet, the piece is referencing the unique reputation, the like increasing attention. The films are becoming more and more widely known. So they're getting like what they're doing, these sort of documentaries that they're making in this way and links to sort of modernization are getting attention. You see that same thing reflected. This is a piece from about the Southern Educational Film Production Service from the New York Times in 1950 that hits on some of the same things. I didn't include the snippet, but the piece starts with sort of saying, these films from the South are getting attention. They are being widely critically praised, and some of them are showing in New York City, is how this article begins. And then it hits on the same sort of notes that Southern leaders are concerned about, quote, human resources and how they develop in terms of natural resources and what's going on in these changes and transitions in the South. The other piece, and this came through in the film news piece a bit, but it's more explicit here. The other thing that comes through in the New York Times piece is that this attention to race, that these films are depicting Black Southerners, and that it's being talked about as like, that's part of these factual documentaries that they're making that are realistic and attuned to what is going on in the South. And that's key to what they're doing. So bringing this back to thinking about my larger project, to All My Babies in Palmer Street, Stoney's connection, Palmer Street's connection to this service, to the Southern Educational Film Production Service, illuminates this larger institutional model that he was participating in and drawing from, but it also reveals that the documentary focus on real people in the South that often took these gendered and racialized forms was part of this much larger and collaborative investment by institutions in the South to modernize the region and its image, to supposedly show the region as it really was, but only really through the lens of these institutional problems as perceived by these segregated public agencies. So with all that said, I'm still really working out this historical background and production or government film production in mid-century Georgia. But I want to turn, just as I sort of move closer to an end here, to that second piece of my project, the impact of these images over time. Why are they important? How do they signify race and gender in this localized way that's also adaptive and received in these sort of national flows of information? So I want to take y'all back to the reuses of All My Babies in Palmer Street in Aftershock and the Queen of Basketball. So, and I do that because I think their reuses, as I'm still figuring them out, speak to the impacts of how these films, original films, are representing race and gender. So I'm going to show you a clip from the clip where Palmer Street is included in the Queen of Basketball. All right.
What I know about Lucy, born in a small town in South Mississippi in 1955. Became a great female basketball player. At one time.
All right. So it seems like that was not showing up for y'all. Let me try this one more time. Are we good?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm so sorry about that. All right, let's try that again.
What I know about Lucy, born in a small town in South Mississippi in 1955. Became a great female basketball player. At one time was the greatest in the United States. As a matter of fact, the New Orleans Jazz drafted Lucy, the first woman to be officially drafted by a men's basketball team. I don't know what else to say about her. She's retired now and living a happy life. Because I'm Lucy. Growing up in a pretty much all Black community, everybody knew each other. That was 11 of us, the big family. Next to the last, Lucy.
All right, I'll stop that there. That's just past the images, those last archival images of the children playing on the porch are the images taken from Palmer Street. All right, I'll just leave it here. I don't need slides for what I have to say. In the Queen of Basketball, as Lucy recounts her childhood growing up in Mentor City, Mississippi during the 1960s, black and white images of children playing outside on their front porches are borrowed from Palmer Street. This moment in the original film, it's from the very beginning of the film, introduces the Merritt children and their parents and their neighborhood to the audience. And it moves very quickly to the question of like father, like son, like mother, like daughter, of like, will these children develop healthily? Comes pretty quickly after that. In the Queen of Basketball, the integration of this footage is used to signify Lucy's coming of age in Mississippi. It provides this generalized visual of the presumed time and place where she developed, as it's framed against the odds in a way, as a basketball player. But Lucy Harris was born in 1955, 6 years after production of Palmer Street. She grew up in the midst of civil rights legislation, affirmative action that expanded to include sex with the passing of Title IX in 1972. As the short documentary narrates and celebrates Lucy's unprecedented accomplishments, its appropriation of Palmer Street reinforces a perspective that generalizes her early life via this black and white footage of kids in a rural Black neighborhood. All right, I'm going to show y'all one more clip, the clip from Aftershock next. I think y'all can see that. Yeah, okay.
Very early in my career, I noticed how Black women were used as guinea pigs in the hospital system. I became a nurse in a very elite teaching hospital. And I start to see things that just really don't go along with my philosophy. If you have private insurance and you're white, you have a private physician who's on call for you. The clinic population, by and large, tends to be Black and brown women who have Medicaid and are treated by resident learners. Every woman is getting her vagina cut open. A woman doesn't need it, but you cut it because you need to learn how to sew. I'm at a place that is literally practicing on people. Black women have been experimented on to perfect the profession of gynecology. The United States had a population of enslaved peoples that they could do what they wanted to, when they wanted to, how they wanted to do it.
All right. The images from All My Babies are featured right before these illustrations and photographs. The image of the doctor and the mother, and that's the exact scene that I referenced earlier in Stoney's sort of description of that, her needing special, quote, special watching from the health officer. During this sequence in Aftershock, in which a nurse midwife details how the treatment of enslaved women became the foundational for institutional practice in the US, the black and white footage from All My Babies shows the mother, Maribel, who's framed as unprepared, being examined by a white doctor in a local clinic. The borrowed moment is part of a sequence that subjects this fictionalized in the original film, the fictionalized mother and midwife, Mary Coley, to the regulation local white clinic, even as the film's instructional narrative frames the relationship between midwife and health department as ideal. In Aftershock, however, the appropriation of this moment from All My Babies pinpoints the sexism and racism of this institutional perspective. Reuse of the scene challenges its original idealism and repositions it in the South, linking the film to a longer history of injustice that carries into the present. And looking at both of these films, The Queen of Basketball borrows documentary images from Palmer Street as realistic archival records of Black family life in the South, applied generally to Lucy's coming of age as an outstanding basketball player. And Aftershock undercuts any sense of realism as it borrows from All My Babies to expose the racist and sexist perspectives at play in the medical treatment of Black women. Both of these reuses link contemporary issues and stories to government-sponsored films and their representations of race and gender in Jim Crow era Georgia. And linking how they were shown in this tension between documentary and institutional perspective to those current issues and how we're representing them in nonfiction forms to draw attention to them. So that is where I'm at with this project. That is all I have for y'all. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open it up.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was terrific. Really, really good. I'm a total documentary junkie, and I've just added to my list about 10 more films. And I teach nonfiction. I just wanted to get us started by asking some questions about George Stoney. He seemed progressive. I mean, the USIS, the U.S. Information Service, was founded by Roosevelt. Truman wanted it cut, and it did. It died. In 15 years, it was around. So Stoney himself was incredibly progressive. He's seen as the father of public television, get corporations out of filmmaking, right? He was part of he helped tenements and the Lower East Side during the height of the Depression. So I was just wondering, he is I don't think he was interrogated by HUAC, right? But there were a lot of socialists involved in these government campaigns, right? And so I was just interested in terms of that. Are you arguing that they bring with them a kind of progressive framework at the same time they're really blind about race and gender? And then I had a follow-up question, like, how did Stoney even get into these people's homes and film such intimate moments of birthing? Right, there's a kind of violence in that as well. And I just was wondering how he negotiated that. And I'll also throw this in. Stoney is a Southerner, right? And so there's that element playing in this as well. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on all of those variables and this in terms of that figure.
Absolutely. Yeah, those are great. Just great sort of questions and things to think about. Yes, absolutely. I think Stoney at the time and as his career develops was progressive. And if you're thinking about working in the South and why he was working in the South and how he was thinking about the South and what he sort of wanted to do. And I think that was, I think there are elements of that in the Southern Educational Film Production Service. I think it becomes, I think in looking at it that, and I think Stoney's a good example of it, of like, there's kind of this like coming out of the war, people that have this interest in documentary and changing these social problems, they're going to change, and this sort of idealism. And I think there's more folks coming, either if they're from the South or they're coming to the South and coming back to the South to think about what do we do to sort of change things. But I think there was just some idealism that like Stoney, I think, thought working with government institutions was the way that it could both could happen, like that he could make these documentary films and like show communities and people that weren't being shown in other forms of media, but that like, and he could be in that negotiated position with the Georgia Department of Public Health. And I think I'm less interested in making sort of an argument about him, like, I mean, and who he was as a person, as like, what were the effects of that? When was it really that ideal? And what was, what maybe did come out of it? We do have documentary images that were, and images that with content that we didn't have elsewhere, but it also came with other, in a particular frame, and that makes sense. And so, I think that's primarily where I'm interested of like, what is the ultimate results of that collaboration? And maybe, and I think it gets a little bit, it becomes easy because in some of the ways that Stoney's talked about, because he's progressive as an individual, he seems like a good guy and how his career developed, but like, does that like draw attention away from like really what are tensions that are coming together in these films, and some things that are, that we need to think about and reckon with a bit more in the images. As far as the question about how he worked and was able to like, so I think he worked with, like, he found Mary Coley by working with the local health department. She was like a midwife and he interviewed numerous midwives from what I recall in looking into it, and that decided on her. She was had a good relationship with the health department, and was like recommended by the health officer. And I think I recall from Stoney saying that he kind of hated the health officer, but like then he ended up really liking Mary Coley and thought she was a really good fit for the film. So I think that he was doing a similar thing of like navigating, like using these institutions to do, and working with these institutions to make the films that he sort of wanted to make. And yeah, I guess my kind of take is that it was a bit, I don't know, there's just some idealism in it that I think that, and maybe it has to do with like understanding documentary at the time, like they were understanding documentary form in a bit of a different way too. I don't think it wasn't really a problem in some ways to think about, well, yes, of course the state makes factual documentaries, where I don't think that we would think about it that way today. Does that get at, did I answer all of your?
Absolutely. And again, he's working within the frame of modernization, right? And
Yeah,
modernization
yes.
very much dictates the logic of the representation.
Absolutely. I think that, yeah. And I think that's another part, like he's, even if he doesn't align himself with the states, I think he thinks ultimately that project of modernization is going to move it in the right direction. Things are going to move in the right direction, and that it should apply to all people, if that kind of mindset.
Great. Thank you. Kari.
Loren, thank you for just such a fascinating and really multi-layered talk. I enjoyed it so much.
Okay.
And just to throw out a possibility, what strikes me, and I think that between what you've said and what Carrie said, there are so many problems with the archive, but I'm struck by how much it might be better to have an archive than to not have one. And like the examples that you gave of the contemporary reuse of some of the material. Mm-hmm. I feel like, we can be resistant readers, we can be very critical, but as a historian, I find that the greatest violence comes when people are just disappeared, when they're not in that, there's nothing to read. You can try to imagine their presence. There may be a haunting. The silences and absences are significant. They signify. But if you don't have an archive, it's just people vanish. So I'm just really struck by the power of the images that you presented.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think that's getting at like one of the sort of key, like, yeah, like things I'm sort of thinking through with this project, in a sense that like these films provide an archive that kind of, as I said earlier, like provides images that are really different than the popular stuff that's out there. They're important in that regard. And my entire project sort of focuses on them. And like, a lot of them are not well known. I mean, these two films in particular do circulate more, but a lot of them are not. And I think it's a balance between like making sense of that archive, bringing it to light, and because it is definitely the government films are just messy, and where they are, who has them, where are the records for them. So, and then also like balancing, like not just the other part of that archive is not neutral. That archive, like, even with All My Babies in Palmer Street, like the preservation of those films is inseparable from Stoney and his persona and his career and how he's perceived and all of that, in a way that other films don't have that same. So like understanding that like we have it and we should use it and acknowledge it. And at the same time, like you said, how do we do that and read that sort of critically and think through it? Because even though this archive is not well known, I do think that I'm interested in these resonances, because these things that were happening, even in local and regional kinds of ways, with government entities, do shape later forms of media, whether we, see those archives in full or not, like if that makes sense. So, yeah, I think it's a key sort of thing to think about, the archival part of it. Makes sense.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Just quickly, does the US government still make films?
That's a great question.
Or are they just consultants to Tom Cruise's latest action film?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that is the Top Gun is interesting, because then they worked with the military for that film, and it happens in those hero films. But I don't actually fully know the answer to that. I would imagine that I don't know if we could think about it as film production as much as like, what are they doing and creating? Is stuff being made in this like more digital social media format? I don't know in terms of I don't have that answer. It'd be an interesting one to think about, or if that is shifted from we don't create that content as much as like, other people are making that content and we use it, promote it, whatever that might be. So I don't have an answer to that. Yeah.
Very good. Well, thank you so much. This has been terrific. I
Well, thank y'all for
appreciate it
coming.
and been wanting to learn more about your work. Thank you, Loren. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us.